Distinguished guests and participants, welcome all to today's high-level political forum session on climate action and SDGs, closing gaps and strengthening synergies. My name is Akio Takemoto, Program Head at UNU Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability. Before we start, I'd like to make some logistical announcements. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the UNU-IAS website together with today's presentation materials. In terms of questions, please submit content-related questions at any time to the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel. We will do our best to answer your questions, but please note that due to time constraints, it may not be possible to answer all questions. So now, I'd like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Hiroshi Ono, Vice Minister for Global Environmental Affairs of Japan, for his opening remarks. Vice Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Takemoto-san. I'm Hiroshi Ono, Vice Minister for Global Environment Affairs of the Ministry of the Environment, Japan. First of all, I would like to thank you all for participating in this side event on climate action and the SDGs. Also, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the United Nations University, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, and IGES for organizing this event. The world is quickly moving towards net zero society laid out by the Paris Agreement. But this decade towards 2030 is not only critical in a sense for achieving decarbonization by mid-century, but also critical to realize SDGs in a win-win way. Today's event aims to understand possible synergies and trade-offs between climate action and SDGs. The experts from around the world will share us concrete examples of effective initiatives to simultaneously achieve the Paris Agreement's 1.5-degree goal and the SDGs. I hope that presented good practices could help you promote further actions at home. The Japanese government has set a goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050 and taking a variety of actions. Let me introduce one concrete example relevant to today's topic. We are working to create more than 100 decarbonization leading areas which strive to achieve net zero emissions by 2030, 20 years ahead of 2050. Such decarbonization areas would be modeled to be replicated all over the country. We call it a decarbonization domino. As the first group of areas, 26 areas have been selected in this April, and they are implementing projects that brings together local governments, local companies, and communities. In doing so, we aim to simultaneously achieve SDGs related to decarbonization, employment, and people's well-being in a mutually supportive manner. Further advancing the idea of facilitating synergies between the Paris Agreement and SDGs, the Ministry of the Environment, Japan, will host the third global conference on strengthening synergies between the Paris Agreement on climate change and the SDGs on July 20th and 21st. It is co-organized by DESA and the UNFCCC Secretariat in a hybrid format, including online and in person, at the United Nations University in Tokyo. This forthcoming event will discuss in greater depth and on a larger scale on how we can accelerate action towards the simultaneous achievement of the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees goal and the SDGs. Given the current energy crisis, it has become increasingly important to reduce dependence on foreign energy sources and secure energy from domestic renewable resources from the perspective of energy security. This meeting will highlight initiatives making use of local renewable energy sources, which also contribute to economic and social development as well as energy security. In addition, we will also discuss subnational decarbonization initiatives and their dissemination to developing countries through intercity cooperation. I look forward to your participation, not only in this event, but also in the Synergy conference on July 20th, 21st. See you in Tokyo in July. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vice Minister Ono, for your very strong messages for us. I'm sorry, I forget mentioning to the organizer of today's event. Today, this event will be co-organized by UNU, UN Department of Social Economic Affairs, DESA, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat, Ministry of Environment Japan, and Institute for Global Environment Strategy of Japan. Okay, thank you very much. So the next, I'd like to give a floor to Professor Shinobu Yamaguchi, Director of UNU-IAS, for providing the framing presentation. Professor Yamaguchi, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, afternoon, and good evening from the United Nations University in Tokyo. As the global leaders gather for this year's high-level political forum on sustainable development, our planet is definitely in crisis, but the solutions are in our hand. The Paris Agreement on climate change and the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development are both at the top of the global agenda. We all know the critical importance of accelerating our actions to achieve both the Paris 1.5 Celsius degree goal and the SDGs. But at the same time, no one can deny that this will require greater ambition and a stronger connection between these two agendas. At the COP26 climate conference last November, the Glasgow Climate Pact was adopted, explicitly aiming to accelerate the climate action and support in the context of sustainable development. Further, the report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC Working Group 3, published this April, included an important chapter focusing on the linkages between mitigation, adaptation, and the sustainable development. And more recently, the meeting held in Stockholm to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the UN Conference on the Human and the Environment reaffirmed that integration can, quote, accelerate system-wide transformation of high-impact sectors such as food, energy, water, buildings, construction, manufacturing, and mobility, unquote. And allow me to say, furthermore, the UN Biodiversity Conference COP15, now scheduled for December this year, is expected to incorporate synergies between biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. In this context, today's event cannot be more timely than ever to advance this urgent topic by identifying the gaps and needing knowledge about synergies and trade-offs between climate actions and sustainable development. And as you can see, we have a diverse group of people from multiple continents with their expertise who will share the actual good practices in key social economic systems. This will definitely help to identify options for systemic approaches to transform the systems for sustainability at local, national, and the global scales. Now, just quickly before concluding, I wish to communicate to you the unique positioning of today's event. As the Vice Minister mentioned, our discussion will be an important contribution to the upcoming third global conference on strengthening synergies between climate change and 2030 agenda, which will take place later this month at the United Nations University in Tokyo and online. Further, the outcome of this event, particularly focusing on the role of research and education in realizing the climate action SDGs, will provide important input for the upcoming Transforming Education Summit, which will be convened by the UN Secretary General during the 77th UN General Assembly in September in New York. So, in concluding, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to all of the distinguished speakers and to our strong partners who are collaborating to organize this event and promote its outcomes in these high-level conferences. But audiences, I am expecting hugely your contribution through question and answers. I look forward to an insightful and inspiring discussion which will advance the global effort to scale up the climate actions and realize the visions of the 2030 agenda. Please enjoy our session and thank you very much, all of you, for your attention. Back to you, Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Professor Yamaguchi, for providing the frame of today's session. So the next, I'd like to invite Dr. Gabriela Jacobuta to provide a keynote speech. Dr. Jacobuta is a researcher at the German Institute for Development and Sustainability within the Environmental Governance Program. The focus of her work is on climate change mitigation policies and measures at the global scale and the associated impacts on sustainable development goals. She addresses the interlinkages between climate and sustainable development action with a view to enhancing policy coherence, enabling joint finance and ensuring a just transition. She obtained her PhD from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Dr. Jacobuta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Takimoto. I will share my screen now. Let's see. Yes, I hope now it's in presentation mode. First of all, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here to present for you today. My name indeed is Gabriela Jacobuta. I am from the German Institute for Development and Sustainability, which was previously known as the German Development Institute, DIE. We have recently changed our name. The title of my presentation today is Climate Action and Sustainable Development, Friends or Foes. I will be presenting some of the research we have done here at IGES, and I hope to add some more regarding the urgency of studying this topic in depth, in addition to the excellent inputs already by Professor Yamaguchi and by the Vice Minister. So the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change were both adopted in 2015, one under the United Nations General Assembly and one under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. While the two agendas were developed in parallel, they are highly interlinked in various ways. And I would summarize these along three lines. One of them is that climate change, if allowed to keep going at the pace it is, it will affect SDG achievement. likely all of the SDGs. Droughts would make it very hard to achieve zero hunger, SDG 2. Heat waves and diseases expanding beyond the tropics would make it very difficult for SDG 3 to be achieved, and also floods and other extreme events would lead to high economic losses and social losses as well. At the same time, if the individual SDGs are implemented in silos without consideration to their effects across other SDGs, we know that implementing the social and economic SDGs would make it very difficult to then also achieve the SDGs, the environmental SDGs, again, if this is not done in a systemic way. And finally, taking action to address climate change can interact in various ways with the SDGs. And this is what I will be going into more detail on today. So here, as we know, a picture speaks 1,000 words. I would like to show to you this research that we have done on the nationally determined contributions of countries. For those of you who don't know, these are climate plans that countries have put forward under the Paris Agreement internationally. We extracted all the climate activities in these plans, more than 8,000 of them, and we distributed them across the SDGs. Here, the size of the bars on the outer circle represent the number of these climate activities that are related very directly to each of those SDGs. And when I say very directly, I mean that these measures can be, for instance, to have climate smart agriculture, to increase irrigation, for instance, that would also be linked to clean water, to have industrial retrofitting, to have greener cities, and also, for instance, to protect forests or to address soil desertification and degradation. What we see here is that the SDGs that seem to be most prominent amongst these climate-related activities are SDGs 2 on hunger, 6 on water, 7 on energy, 9 industry, 11 cities, 15 life on land, and also 17 partnerships. So here we see that the linkages are very strong. What we also notice, though, is that the social SDGs are not as strongly covered by these climate activities, in particular SDG 1 on poverty, 3 on health, 4 on education, and then 5 and 10 on inequalities, as well as 16 on peace and strong institutions. This is very important because we know that addressing poverty and inequality would help increase the resilience of vulnerable groups. Moreover, education will be essential for helping our societies make greener and better, more sustainable lifestyle choices, and also to prepare the professionals that will be needed for these transitions, both for the SDGs and for climate. So just to go back here, what we see really is that the climate plans are actually sustainable development plans. They are not just climate plans. This is a very important message. And the same message we also see when we look at climate relevant finance. Here we looked at official development assistance between 2010 and 2018 that was marked as relevant for climate, either as a primary objective or as a secondary objective. And what we see, again, is that this finance also contributes across the board to all of the SDGs, in particular SDG 2 on food, SDG 6 on water, 7 on energy, 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and 15 on life on land. Again, the same situation with the social SDGs being less addressed. However, those were only very direct links, meaning that those measures were taken specifically in that area. Nonetheless, we know that action for any SDG has secondary effects on other SDGs as well. And this is also the case for climate. In order to better understand what would be the effects of addressing the climate issue, we did an extended literature review to identify all of the possible effects of climate change mitigation measure in this case. And of course, the adaptation measures would also have their own effects on the SDGs. In order to analyze all of the findings from this literature review, we scored the identified effects on a 5-point scale, with 2 when actions effects are always positive and they always occur. 1 when these effects are positive, meaning co-benefits, but they don't always occur, and this depends on the context. We will discuss about this further. 0 when it can be either positive or negative, -1 when it would be negative but it doesn't always occur, and -2 when it is negative and it always occurs. So to give you an overview here, for instance, of the energy supply sector. So these, what you see here on the vertical on the left, are all potential measures that could be taken to make a switch from high carbon intensity fuels to low carbon fuels. So you see a lot of measures, for instance, implementing renewables, but also carbon capture and storage, what we shorten there, abbreviated as CCS. And waste to energy and landfill energy measures. The pie charts here represent the share of affected targets of each SDG. As we know, each SDG has a number of targets, and here we looked at each of the targets and determined which of them would be affected positively or negatively based on the scale that I have just shown you. And what we can see, first of all, is that while these measures in the previous research would have only been shown under SDG 7, or most of them only under SDG 7 because they directly address energy, they actually have impacts on most other SDGs as well. The good news is that most of these effects are positive. We see that there is a lot of green in this pie chart. And we see also which of the SDGs are primarily affected. We see that there are many effects in SDG 6, for instance, that water usage would be reduced and there will be less water pollution. 7, of course, is positively affected because there will be clean energy and perhaps better access to energy. Also 9 on industry, because industries could be greened. Also cities could be greened, and so on. However, there are also some negative effects, and these are particularly important as they would need to be addressed. For instance, in the case of bioenergy, it is important to note that there can be effects on water, for instance, if there's high use of water for biodiversity production. Also, if there's fertilizer use, there can be also water pollution and also soil pollution. And also bioenergy could compete with land for agriculture, and it could also increase the price on land, which would make it harder for small-scale farmers. Fossil fuel carbon storage, carbon capture and storage would require more energy and also more water for this process. That means that the price of energy would likely go up. Also, there will be more water consumption and related pollution. And also there will be all sorts of other negative effects related to an increased use of fossil fuels. When we look at the demand side, here the first 2 boxes in particular, we see that the effects are really mostly positive. Also, when we look to agriculture, forestry, and land use, we see some positive effects. And then there are also some areas of potential concern. For instance, when it comes to forest protection, if there are communities that depend on those resources for food or for energy, and then they are not allowed access in those areas, it is important to take these communities into account and potentially provide compensation or allow them access, providing these exemptions. Energy taxes can also be problematic for poor households. And we know that in particular, poor households tend to spend a higher share of their income on energy. So here also particular care should be taken when policies are implemented. So to understand how some of these effects can be addressed, we looked at the contexts in which these measures appear, or the context that might affect the magnitude of these effects when we know that they would appear anyway, but then their effect might be higher or lower depending on this context and how policies work with them. So one of them is time horizon, and this indicates that a policy impact may manifest in the opposite direction in the short term as opposed to the long term. So to give you an example here, for instance, retrofitting buildings to improve energy efficiency, or installing renewable energy, for instance, solar rooftops and so on, will have high upfront costs. How policymakers could overcome some of these barriers would be, for instance, by providing loans, potentially concessional loans, and maybe even grants for citizens who would like to undertake such projects. The savings coming from this project, despite those upfront costs, will overcompensate and will allow them to pay and also to make money in the long run. Another context dimension is the local dimension, and this indicates that the policy impact's occurrence or magnitude would be influenced by the location where a specific project is implemented, or where a measure takes effect. So, for instance, in the case of hydropower plants, it is possible that communities would need to be displaced in the area. Therefore, the location would be an important aspect that any hydropower project would have to consider in order to reduce such potential negative effects on the surrounding communities, but also on the surrounding biodiversity. Similarly, for biofuels and large monocultures, biodiversity can be a concern in terms of location. Then there's the context of governance, and this indicates that the policy impact's occurrence and magnitude relate to the implementation approach. And this can have three dimensions. It can be choice of technology, for instance. It can refer to guidelines on processes, or it can talk about scope or applicability of policies. In terms of scope or applicability of policies, for instance, I was earlier mentioning energy taxes and that they could affect poorer groups. What policymakers could do in this case would be to either provide exemptions for those groups, so not to apply that policy to them, or to provide compensation in various forms. In terms of processes, for instance, in the case of biofuels, there can be high standards on how much fertilizer can be used or how irrigation is allowed. Is it rain-fed, or is it, for instance, with precision irrigation and so on. And I will move finally to natural resources or limited fuels, and this refers in particular to fossil fuel and to nuclear, and that the switch would affect countries that have a different relation to these limited fuels in different ways. For instance, a country that imports a lot of its fossil fuels for its energy production would actually benefit from reducing these fossil fuels. A country that produces fossil fuels and uses it for its own consumption could lose some jobs in this case, and then it should develop new job opportunities for people in those affected regions, as well as new plans for new economic activities. Also, countries who are exporters of fossil fuels could have some negative effects, economically speaking. So quickly, so that I don't go over time too much, it's key messages. Climate plans are sustainable development plans. As we've seen, all climate measures have a wide variety of effects on the SDGs. Similarly, climate finance is SDG finance. Climate relevant official development assistance, as we've seen, directly contributes to all of the sustainable development goals. The effects of climate measures on the SDGs, also going beyond these very direct effects, are mostly positive. That is the good news. However, there are also some trade-offs which must be considered, and as we have seen, there are measures that can be designed so that synergies are enhanced and trade-offs are reduced. In particular, by taking into consideration the context I mentioned, so time, location, governance approaches, and the limited resources in that country. As key important gaps, climate measures related to the social SDGs, as we have seen, are currently very limited, although some of them would be very important. So this is something to look into. More innovative policies will be necessary in order to address the interlinkages between climate and SDGs. And we would need to further expand our understanding of effects going beyond this very direct primary and secondary effects. Thank you very much. I will look forward to the discussion further today and to any possible questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gabriela, for your very rich and insightful presentation, utilizing a lot of evidence. Thank you very much. So now I would like to move on to the panel discussion. The panel session will be facilitated by Dr. Shen Xiaomeng, UNU Vice Rector in Europe and Director of UNU Institute for Environment and Human Security, UNU-IAS. So I'd like to hand over the mic to Dr. Xiaomeng. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Gabriela, for the very interesting and rich keynote. A lot of people have already said the interrelations between SDGs and climate actions. So I'm not going to repeat what has been said. And also given the time, I'm just going to say a couple of housekeeping rules. Since we are about 12 minutes over the time, so I would like to ask each of the panelists to shorten your presentation slightly to make it 5 to 6 minutes, so that we could also look at some of the very interesting questions already in the chat box later on to the keynote speech, but also to what you will be saying as panelists. So each of the panelists will be given 5 to 6 minutes to make a short statement. If you can keep it to 5, that would be wonderful. And your statement should address 3 questions. The first question is, in what area do you see the critical gaps between climate action and sustainable development? The second question is, what are the existing and potential ways to close these gaps, minimizing trade-offs and promoting co-benefits to realize synergies between climate actions and SDGs? The third question is, what role can research and education play in closing gaps and strengthening the synergies? You don't have to address all of 3 questions, you can choose 1 or 2, but if you prefer addressing all of them, that's fine as well. So now I would like to invite the first panelist, Minoru Takada, who is the team leader of Sustainable Energy of DESA. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. It's a pleasure to be here again. Every year, the United Nations University is organizing this side event in the high-level political forum. It's really a sort of very informative session. Thank you very much. And it comes at a very much right time in that, in Tokyo, there will be the 3rd global conference on strengthening synergies between Paris Agreement on climate change and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Already Vice Minister from the Ministry of the Environment in Japan, who is hosting this conference, already explained to you more. And it's a pleasure as DESA, together with the UNFCCC Secretariat, co-convening this conference for the 3rd time. And then at this time joined by United Nations University and IGES and many other colleagues and the group of organizations who are supporting this one. Why we're doing this one? It's very laid out clearly by the keynote presentation. Let me say 3 gaps here, ambition gaps here. Still, if you look at macro picture at the national level, although globally, we of course agreed on 2030 agenda and the Paris, at the national level, ambitions are not fully aligned. If you look at the nationally determined contributions, as much as they might like to be on the 1.5 degree pathway and the resilient society, they are not there yet. You have seen so many reviews done by the many organizations getting there. We are not yet there to get to net zero by 2050, given the current policy and the ambition trajectory. At the same time, sustainable development goals are not fully reflected either in the national scheme of things. So we have an urgent job to do over the next few years to raise this ambition, making sure at the national level, all the national ambitions are going to be fully aligned to the achievement of SDGs and net zero emissions by 2050. The secondary implementation gaps. While ambitions are gradually catching up, not there yet, but gradually coming there, it's very clear implementations are uneven. If you look at some of the sort of progress area that are being made today, for example, the global annual SDG progress report is going to be launched at noon, by the way, in New York. And you'll be able to see uneven progress across SDGs and the many targets. Let's take an example of energy here. The renewable energy, thanks to many the countries, the commitment, it's catching up. But on the other hand, for example, access to electricity, access to clean cooking solutions, they are part of SDG 7 framework, they are lagging behind. This is on the macro level also illustrated by the keynote presenters in that while on one hand, certain SDGs are well covered by the climate interventions, on the other hand, other SDGs are not, particularly those SDGs that are pertaining to the social the responsibilities. This is very important in the sense that we want to make sure that transitions are going to be just, inclusive, and equitable to leave no one behind. And this is in the fundamental areas where we have to take much more strong actions to make sure we're going to fill this implementation gap in some of those areas. And that comes to the financing here. The financing on the macro level or the achievement of SDGs, broadly speaking, $5 to $7 trillion per year. That is sort of one calculation. On the other hand, climate part, depending on how you take ambitions, obviously it takes a lot more money, but I think one estimate say around $5 trillion per year, at least to start with. So it's clear that, taking strong action on climate change must be fully in sync with the action to achieve SDGs, because on the macro scale, the both investment figures are coming together. So there is a sort of enormous need for integrated approaches to address both climate action on the mitigation and adaptation side, as well as achievement of SDGs and across all the SDGs. So those are the three areas of a gap that we have to address on the macro level. Why this conference is going to be important? There are three things that we want to achieve. Number one, we want to compile, gather, and share experiences to date that are done at the national level, done by the public sector, but also by the private sector, as to how much they are actually making a difference by doing what they need to be doing. And in so doing, of course, there will be a lot of areas where gaps needs to be filled. So they're both sort of highlighting good practices, but also both highlighting also the areas of challenges, and that tend to be an opportunity that we have to work on. And that's sort of one thing that we want to do through the conference in Tokyo. The second, once we compile those experiences and identify areas of gaps, potentially we should be able to come to a new understanding as to how to sort of bring those integrated solutions to synergize all the actions at the sort of more coherent way and the macro level. Now, such sort of, let's say, the integrated sort of actionable concept, in fact, does not exist. for a variety of reasons, the intergovernmental processes are in itself quite siloed. So there should be a way to complement intergovernmental processes in such a way that, the implementation and also on the ground practical knowledges and experiences try to fill in the gaps here. So by bringing in intergovernmentally agreed goals and targets and processes, supported by the experiences coming from the ground, we should be able to elevate our understanding as to what needs to be done, how we can address those gaps, what I call sort of actionable new concept of integrated approaches. Can we get there? I don't know, but this is an ambition of the Tokyo conference and the beginning of that type of conversation to come over the next couple of years to come. Why a couple of years is very important? Obviously, 2030 is approaching. So this comes to the third point of mainstreaming here, is that 2023 is an opportunity in that SDG Summit is coming up. And this is a 4-year cycle. The following SDG Summit is going to be 2027. From 2023 to 2027, if we don't make a difference in the achievement of SDGs, you forget it. So this is a time to bring bold ideas, bold actions, and then a bold sort of implementations to come together to make a difference, coupled with more enlightened, high ambitious climate actions to go forward. So I'll stop here in terms of laying out what we want to achieve through the third conference in Tokyo. And then I hope that everybody will be able to join us. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your input. You talked about ambition gaps and also possible pathways by increasing intergovernmental agreed goals and using the experience from the ground. Very good. Let's move on to the second panelist, Sergei Kononov, who is the manager of Department for Programs Coordination of UNFCCC. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, may I ask to display the slide? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, entered into force in the early 1990s, and it was already recognized at that time that action on climate change is inseparable from a broader context of sustainable development. More recently, in 2015, the Paris Agreement explicitly recognized the intrinsic relationship that climate change actions, responses, and impacts have with equitable access to sustainable development and eradication of poverty. Consequently, linkages between climate action and sustainable development, including sustainable development goals, have been well recognized in the implementation of the Climate Change Convention at both national and international levels. Let me elaborate a bit on these two facets, international and national, and in doing so, I will be also referring to what you see on the slide without necessarily repeating these bullets. At the international level, the most recent climate change conference in Glasgow last year adopted the so-called Glasgow Climate Act and many other decisions aiming to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This strengthened action on climate change consistent with SDG 13, but it also helped in the implementation of a number of other SDGs closely linked to climate action, in particular SDG 5 on gender equality, 7 on affordable and clean energy, 8 decent work and economic growth, 11 sustainable cities and communities, 14 and 15 life below water and on land, 16 peace, justice, and strong institutions, and last but definitely not least, SDG 17, partnerships for the goal. At the national level, the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, submitted by countries under the Paris Agreements have started providing valuable information on how climate action in both adaptation and mitigation relates to sustainable development. This is illustrated in the two graphs which you see on slide, and this was also shown so well in the presentation by Dr. Yakabuta a bit earlier today. Well, a couple of examples. We know that action on adaptation to climate change is most frequently linked to food production and nutrition security, to freshwater resources, terrestrial and wetland ecosystems, and health. And these are the areas addressed, as we know, under SDGs 2, 6, 15, and 3. Similarly, measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions are often linked with other measures in energy supply, contributing to achieving SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, and SDG 15, life on land, when measures in land use change, and forestry are taken. So these are the strong linkages, but it's also the areas where most close attention is required, because that's where the impacts are the strongest. To be a bit more specific, let me give you one example. Actions to address land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change are well known to play complementary reinforcing roles. Systems set up to address either of these issues will eventually benefit the others. It means that at national level, we need strong interaction and coordination in addressing the goals and targets on land degradation, biodiversity, and climate change, and ultimately this will be also in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. These were kind of good examples, but with the good examples, we should not also lose sight of the remaining challenges, which are quite a few. At the national level, coordination and cooperation of relevant national institutions is key for planning and implementation of climate change policies and actions. But this is also key for making climate action fully integrated into the relevant economic and social policies consistent with sustainable development. And this also includes the receipt and use of international support. Also here, coordination and cooperation are key to ensure that those resources are used in a manner that fits best the priorities of sustainable development. Such coordination already happens through a variety of arrangements, but coherent, coordinated, and efficient implementation of all sustainability dimensions remains a challenge, requiring close attention by governments and non-governmental stakeholders. Looking at the international level, cooperation among international organizations within the United Nations in particular is needed to address these linkages effectively and efficiently. Our Secretariat is strongly engaged in such cooperation, for example, through the joint liaison group of the 3 Rio Conventions, which aims to promote implementation of transformative projects that integrate action on land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change. There are also other mechanisms of collaboration and cooperation. We know them, we can talk about them, but we also know that what's happening now is not sufficient. In short, we believe that we have started addressing linkages between climate action and sustainable development, but it's only a beginning and needs to be done, and we need to do much more. What we need in general are strong collaborating institutions at the national and international levels with the ability to understand, advise, and ultimately act on aligning national development priority with specific actions on climate change and other sustainability dimensions. This is not easy in practice, but this is the only way to move forward towards genuine sustainable development efficiently and coherently. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sergi. I get your clear message that both on international and national levels, more needs to be done. And also climate actions need to be urgently integrated into social aspects to serve social goals. Thank you very much. And now I would like to move to Bartal, the director of Assisi Institute, UNU-IAS. Bartal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Director Shen, and I'd also like to thank the organizers, especially United Nations University, in organizing with the other partners this very important side event at the High Level Political Forum. what I would like to share with you is very much in line, obviously, with what has been said before. I think we are now fully experiencing also in our countries where we probably have less of an awareness of the impact of climate change, but also here, as we speak in Maastricht, in the beautiful Netherlands, we're organizing a conference that addresses the impact of climate change on the socio-economic development of the region. And this is the topic that we need to discuss. What does it mean that we see the impacts of climate change that have been described before on the realization of the SDGs that we as UN institutes and agencies want to achieve? And I think it's a very simple message that I would like to share with you, the audience of this session. We are living in very complicated times, very complex times. We also need the science and the research to be able to deal with that. And that has a couple of implications for the way that we work also as a UNU institute in dealing with these complex problems. I would like to highlight a few of them. One is for sure that we, and by extension, almost all academic research as we know it, has throughout the history been highly compartmentalized. We see that in the structure of universities. We have faculties in sciences, in humanities, and whatever other division you can think of. Compartments, separated in culture, in scientific approach, in leadership, and not used to talk to each other. I think that model in itself almost prohibits the collaboration that we do need for dealing with the challenges that we're confronted with. It is changing slowly, but it's definitely not there yet where we want it to be. In order to deal with the complex situation, there's another issue. I think the scientific disciplines that we're versed in, and many of us are scientists in one discipline or another, and we probably are very good at it, but we also need to have an awareness, a knowledge, and an experience in other disciplines, because we want to become multidisciplinary. We want to work multidisciplinary. And in that sense, it is probably a prerequisite that in our training programs, the way we educate our students, that we open their eyes to the other disciplines that are out there. So even if we train a mathematician, and I myself, I am a mathematician, but even these people could benefit from being exposed to the humanities and social sciences. Because in the end, even mathematics has its applications in the real world, and we better be aware of what that means when we educate our students. So the multidisciplinarity that we need today to deal with the complex issues that have been mentioned before, and I'm repeating here, requires a different approach to training, education, and also the way we work. We've tried here in Maastricht to work together with 3 different UNU institutes from 3 different countries. And to my knowledge, this event that we organize here is a first example of that. And I think that's where the future lies. If we could only get over our own institutional limits and borders and barriers to really work together on this complex interaction, this complex system that we're dealing with every day. That may have sound familiar, because I'm definitely not the first one to plead for this, but I think the message has only become a lot more urgent, because we are talking here in this panel on climate change and the achievement of the SDGs, but there's still, at the same time, a lot of other things happening. Now, we are still in a pandemic. We are now witnessing a war close to Europe in our case, which may have global effects, or will have global effects, better said, that also impact, again, the achievement of the SDGs, while climate change is looming in the background. So for maybe the first time in our research careers or research activities, we see that multiple crises at the same time impact what we do. And we used to be able to focus on just one, as if that is not enough. Of course, we prefer to have a simple crisis, simple quote unquote, that we can devote all our attention to. But today we are confronted with multiple crises at the same time. And to deal with these crises requires a new type of researcher, a new type of dealing with these crises that extends beyond the boundaries of the institutes that we're working in, beyond the boundaries of the agencies that we're dealing with, and involving everybody who is affected by the crisis. So not only do we need to get out of our traditional boundaries of research discipline, we need to work with communities that are affected, with local stakeholders and global stakeholders. So my message is here to the panel, as member of the panel, to you who are listening to this, is it is now more urgent than ever that we get out of these institutional barriers. And that relates also to some of the points that the previous speaker mentioned. We need also to adapt our funding. We need to adapt our financing. Why on earth are we competing as many different organizations for the same amount of funding all the time? And some of us win, others lose. And when that has happened, we repeat the same cycle. Would it not be much better to advance ahead of that funding cycle and define a collaboration, and we all get a piece of the cake? And I think that is the best way to have that discussion among us. What are our priorities? What are our strengths? Where are we complementary? And then apply for the funding that we think we need to achieve the goals. So dear participants, I think it's a challenging time to be in. We as directors of UNU institutes in this UNU session are confronted with a world that is increasingly complex and increasingly difficult to focus on just a single problem. The session here, the problem between the impact of climate change and achievement of SDGs is a perfect example of that. So I would like to conclude my short intervention here on this panel by again arguing for stepping out or stepping over our boundaries, reaching out to each other, agree on a common agenda that we want to achieve, and then act. And I think it's the perfect time to do that. So thank you very much, Sharman, for the time to speak on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Batal. What you have said was music to my ears. I think it is true in such challenging times, facing multiple crises, we need to work much more together and break down the disciplinary boundaries and institutional boundaries to truly collaborate with each other so that we could connect the dots to serve climate actions and SDGs. All right, thank you very much, Batal. And now we have about 30 minutes left. So I have to ask the rest of the panelists really to stick to the time, 5 to 6 minutes, and so that we can allow 1 or 2 questions at least, because I saw a lot of interesting questions from the audience. Okay, now Melissa Brown-Goodall, I hope that I pronounced your name correctly. So she's a senior director of Penn Environmental Innovations Initiative from University of Pennsylvania. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I will do my very best. Thank you so much for having me. I'm setting my timer so that I can hopefully stick to the time because this has been absolutely fascinating. I run a program called Environmental Innovations Initiative at the University of Pennsylvania, so it's my job to connect across all the disciplines. So this is perfect timing for my presentation. I'm very excited about this. My perspective on this is what do we need to govern globally, and sort of taking a step back from all of the frameworks that we've done so far. And what I work on is looking at this from the absolute global perspective. So things that impact areas of the planet that transcend any nation's jurisdiction, transboundary issues, transnational activities that threaten local environmental resources, and local challenges with ubiquitous consequences. So that's the big sort of frame that I look at. And then as we look at the climate change crisis and the biodiversity crisis writ large, these are really, really huge concepts, and they tend to be pigeonholed into an environmental pocket of global policy. But the reality is we have the Sustainable Development Goals to humanize those big challenges and make them actionable. This is my perspective of making these things that people don't really relate to feel like they can be managed. So then in terms of that last question that was mentioned at the beginning, what role can research and education play in closing this gap, the gaps in strengthening synergies? Any higher education university is focused on research, teaching, and service. But what makes us unique is that we have a mission that's based on knowledge generation, not advocacy or the bottom line. We have thought leadership in the form of our faculty. We can play a conversation leadership role by being a neutral forum. We play a service role, which I'll get into. We are frequently an anchor institution for our communities. We work with the public sector, the private sector, et cetera. And we have students, next generation leadership. In terms of students, we frequently think of this sort of mindset, especially when I show a picture of Greta Thunberg. But the reality is every single one of these folks in this picture went to university at one point. So this mindset of training every single person in climate ethics, planetary ethics is important. We're doing that at the University of Pennsylvania by integrating this into the curriculum for every single one of our schools. We also run a program, it's a global program. Some of my students are on the call today, where we offer programming to connect the global challenges to local actions for students around the world. In terms of research for solutions, this is extremely important. This is our job. Generating knowledge is our job. So my team is working on connecting the teaching and research of every faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're using this database to foster synergy between disciplines so that we can run programs to connect across disciplines around targeted research programs that must have public-facing outcomes and opportunities for students to get involved. Some examples of this, we're doing environmental education in certain areas of Pennsylvania. We're training K-12 teachers on climate justice education. We're developing regenerative agriculture approaches. We're testing technologies for heat islands in the city of Philadelphia. We're looking at mercury flows in the world using with the School of Dental Medicine and our biogeochemists. And we're looking at the efficacy of large green infrastructure installations. So really a broad variety of projects just stemming from our own faculty. Now imagine the capacity of that were we to do it at a much larger scale around the world. I also want to highlight the role of higher education institutions as mission-driven organizations through a program at the Yale School of the Environment and Columbia's Earth Institute that looks at indicators for all countries and ranks how well countries are managing their natural resource endowment, as well as the Global Environmental Governance Project, which is currently moving as of this past week to Northeastern University in Boston. This actually looks at the efficacy of global environmental multilateral environmental agreements and really taking a close look at whether countries are following through and whether they're actually reporting on their progress. And it's very important that we play this role as a neutral party, as an honest broker in this situation. So I will conclude with a quick note to say, I really feel like there's a conversation to be had about the knowledge sector. The NDCs are obviously, we've just heard, not sufficient, and one of the priorities of COP27 is strengthening engagement with non-party stakeholders. Achieving the SDGs by 2030 will require moving beyond best practices toward transformative change. And so we need stronger ambition and stronger connections, and I would assert that really affirming this by creating this collaborative momentum with the over 25,000 universities in the world could be a part of the solution. And I will stop there because I'm exactly at 5 minutes, 20 seconds.
Thank you. Excellent. Wonderful, Melissa. Thank you so much for your input. I'm glad that you continued with education and took up what Basel has started. I also really like your idea of having SDGs as humanizing factor for the grand challenges. And next generation training is absolutely important and key for sustainable development. And we're also really glad to see that you see education and research as a mission, as a mission-driven activity and driven by those grand challenges, not only research for research sake. So that's a very promising attitude for education and research. Thank you so much, Melissa. Now, Eric Tambo is academic officer at UNU Bonn, Institute for Environment, Human Security and he has some quite unique perspectives on SDGs and climate actions. Eric, floor is yours.
Many thanks, Charmaine, for the kind introduction, and also thanks for the invitation and the wonderful presentation so far. So I don't know if you are able to see my screen. So
yes, we can. Just pay attention to time. Stick to 5 or 6 minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, I will do the best to stick to 5 and 6 minutes. So what I want to address in the presentation is frugal green innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship as approach to close the gap between climate action and SDG while contributing to economic transformation in developing countries. What I want first to bring the perspective of developing countries in this debate of climate change and climate action, it's always very related to economic development. If I take the example of the African continents, where the unemployability of the youth is a major factor. So when we are talking about climate action, we are talking about climate change, the realities at their level. So for the leaders at the national, at the global, and at the Pan-African level, it's really an issue of economic transformation. How can you link this agenda, this global agenda, with the economic transformation? From this perspective, I'm trying to address how the gaps will be closed. Green technology and sustainability represent a huge market. So according to, so we can talk about approximately $9.6 billion, and it's projected to be $21 billion in 2019 and 2017. So the investment also in green technology in developing countries are increasing. And if we combine this different approach, and when we look particularly, if I take the example of the Africa, if we look the mobile penetration over the last 20 decades, we look the innovation which have arisen through the through youth, particularly when we are looking the mobile sectors, the fintech sectors. When we are talking today about mobile payment and MPESA, that are all innovation which came through digitalization, and we don't also through mobile penetration. What we are seeing over the recent decade is that this innovation and this frugal innovation are moving into other sectors, particularly green sectors. In agriculture, we see youth developing interesting innovation to support farmers to access prices on the market. In the water sectors, mobile payments, so prepaid payment to regulate also the payment of water in agricultural sectors. So what we are seeing, the innovation that the youth have initially developed in the mobile sectors and the fintech sector are moving across other sectors, green sectors, renewable energy, water, waste management. One of the big challenges now is that it's still fragmented. We don't have a kind of structural approach to support this youth to increase or to upscale the level of innovation. So, and one way how can we do that is at least to create a framework which bring the different stakeholders which can support this youth to come together. I think Professor Barton has talked about getting out of the institutional barriers and also across the discipline. We have one project that we are currently implementing at the Institute in Bonn, which is called Youth and Women Green Entrepreneurship, where we are building on the triple helix of innovation, which bring together the policy actors, the government together, and the academia. We have extended this framework with the stakeholders which are really driving the innovation in the continent so far. Because when we are talking on mobile development, we are talking about technology and innovation hubs, where all these innovation are taking place, not necessarily at the university. It's what we call these informal spaces of innovation. So where this innovation is taking place with their ecosystem, it's also linked to fundings actors, business angel, venture capitals. So how can we set up an ecosystem where we bring together the technology and innovation hub, the academia, the government, the policy actors, and the regional actors? So that we have extended this triple helix on what we call the quintuple helix. So, and one of the practical approach on how this will be implemented was looking like are the innovation centers of the World Bank. It's a concept that have been initiated by the World Bank with the UNFCCC and also the Carbon Trust, which is a kind of implementation of this approach, which bring together these different actors to provide to you an environment, the enable environment to design innovation which can contribute to SDGs and also to climate action. A typical innovation center, they have in the continents 3 so far, one in Kenya, the Climate Innovation Center, another one in Ghana. So it's a network. So they are working on technology need assessment, facilitating and coordinating research and demonstration, analyzing market barrier, facilitating the deployment and policy of the program, and also advancing regulatory, so also capacity building and training. So this specific technology and innovation hub, which address specific green sectors with all the necessary different actors which can play a role. So they analyze the design specific capacity building program, incubation program, and also to support the ideation and the incubation of specific solutions in the green sectors leading to startup. And the interaction which come out of this ecosystem is also derived through policy, which gives into policy forum like the African Union or the UN or the UN or the UNFCCC or the UNFCCC. So the approach that we at the PACET, the Pan-African Cooperation and Educational Technology, it's a group at the United Nations University, the Institute in Bonn, the approach really to address these issues of climate action and sustainable development goal is through entrepreneurship. And how could you bring youth into this debate and create an enabling environment to support them to design sustainable solution, practical solution and startup which can contribute to address these different goals. If we are talking on the specific roles of education and research in this particular context, research is closely linked to applied research. Applied research bringing together, in this development context, you have this what they call Fab Labs. They are technical labs with equipped with 3D printings or specific software for prototyping. So at least to develop specific solution. So, and what we have, what we think is to bring these specific actors of these informal actors of innovation and entrepreneurship with the classical education. So classical education meaning if you have to design an innovation toward renewable energy, for example, you need some hard skills on energy generation or grid or mini grid. So that is the advantage that the university have to provide this hard skill into teachings. But then when it comes to practical application and leading to entrepreneurship, how could you combine this, that with the advantage that this technology and innovation hub have, which is the agility, the reality to the market. So we designed in one of our projects that we call Impulse South, what we call an entrepreneurial incubator, where we bring the advantage of the classical innovation and the advantage on the other side of the technology and innovation hub. We have 4 courses in this program on climate ambition, monitoring and reporting, climate action, climate innovation, climate finances, where we give the hard skills on how to address the funding, for example, of the international carbon market. That is a theoretical course. But inside all of these courses, we have practical courses where we bring already the student together and we try to support them in developing specific ideas which can lead later to a solution. And after this theoretical and practical part, we have virtual incubation where we give them some seed grant and we expose them with some mentors and pitching so that at the end, they could design some kind of specific solution and set up startup which will then go through some further scale like funding through venture capitalists. So speaking about the role of education and research is in this context is an unusual role. How do you really combine the technology and innovation hub space ecosystem with the classical education to produce a specific solution which can lead also to startup and create employment? So at least that is the approach how at least we will see the role of education and research in this context, but at the broader range is really to see how far the different actors which can contribute to support innovation and entrepreneurship. How could we create a framework to bring them all together is the way how we see the connection between let's say how the gap between climate action, SDGs and entrepreneurship.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. It's very nice that you have brought also some concrete examples and showed us some pathways how to really combine research, education, innovation to fill in the gaps between SDGs and climate actions. So that was a continuation what Melissa has mentioned about mission-driven research, mission-driven education. Thank you very much, Eric. Now we have our last but not least panelist, Junko Ataki, who is the research manager at Kitakyushu Urban Center from IGES. The floor is yours, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm Junko Akagi of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, IGES. I belong to one of the satellite offices of IGES located in Kitakyushu City, Japan. Our research area is sustainable cities, and we work with various stakeholders on projects and research while encouraging local action to accelerate the transition on sustainable cities. Our focus area includes both zero carbon cities and also localizing SDGs. So I would like to share my views on gaps in terms of local implementation. So here I raised 3 points as critical gaps. The first is the policy integration and alignment. Without this, we cannot obtain any synergy effects. Second is the stakeholder engagement. The multi-stakeholder approach is needed, but it's not easy to involve different stakeholder groups sometimes. The third is the psychological barrier to changing their existing work style and lifestyle. This might be related to the barrier or hinder the stakeholder engagement. So in order to close the gap, I raised 2 points here as ways to close the gaps. One is awareness raising through dialogue and pilot projects. It is important to share the significance of climate actions and SDGs with stakeholders through dialogue. A shared significance or shared vision will help overcome psychological barriers, I think. Also, regular dialogue helps actions move forward in an expected manner. The second point, the establishing a supporting scheme for a project that targets synergies may also be an option. For example, Japanese government embodied the concept of regional circular and ecological sphere, which brings synergy between climate action and SDGs at the local level. The government also promotes 100 decarbonization leading areas that was mentioned at the opening remarks, and that also realized the net zero CO2 emissions from the household sector by 2030. The project scheme sets a requirement to provide co-benefits clearly, and proposal development process provides a good capacity building opportunities, I think. Also, success factor and challenges for creating synergies may be identified through the project implementation. So for that purpose, close the gaps, providing quality information and education is needed. It may be sometimes tough to understand nexus between agenda items. So more information such as scientific evidence and good practices is needed to convince people to get their actions started. And capacity building is also needed, not only for young generation, but also adults. So the recurrent education may be a good way of offering education for adults. So I think this would be the role of research and education can play to solve this problem. So that's from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You stuck very well to the time and mentioned some very important gaps as well. While we were talking, I think the panelists are very diligent in answering the questions. What I can see from the answer and question section on the chat is that all of the questions have been responded. So there were 70 answers. There's only one open, but I don't really see the question. Does anyone still have a question from the audience? Then you need to retype your question. Otherwise, all the questions disappears from me. For me.
I do have one question. I can also answer by typing.
Go ahead.
Should I? No. I think it's better to answer by typing because it was a follow-up question.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Thank you. Then you can continue typing. Thank you so much. All right. I think we are really well on time, and the content was extremely rich. And we have now 10 minutes, so we can just carry out the planned schedule. To summarize is quite challenging because from the keynote and all the contributions of the panelists, there is a very broad range of knowledge here and a lot of important points mentioned. So I'll try to summarize a little bit along the line of the three questions. The first question is, in what areas do you see the critical gaps between climate action and sustainable development? What I can take away is that we all agree that there are not enough climate actions. We need to raise ambitions. And also there is a lack of linkages between climate actions and SDGs. These linkages need to be strengthened. And the second gap is a policy gap. For instance, SDGs are not always integrated into national policies. And there is a need for policy integration and alignment. And then there is a gap mentioned by Taki-san, and the psychological barriers. I think that's a very important one. The United Nations Secretary General also initiated behavioral science, because we need to understand why we behave the way we do to change our lifestyle and work style to be able to cater to the needs of the global crisis. Thank you very much for mentioning this psychological barrier. And the second question is, what are the existing and potential ways to close these gaps, minimizing trade-offs and promoting co-benefits to realize synergies between climate actions and SDGs? Again, there is a lot of material out there. I cannot repeat everything here, so I just want to mention 2 points. One is work with networks, and we need to work with partners, engage stakeholders, and in the meantime, we need to work in private-public partnerships. Green technology, for instance, and economic transition towards green economy seems to be one of the pathways as examples to strengthen the synergy between SDG goals and also the climate actions. The third question is, what role can research and education play in closing the gaps and strengthening the synergies? This we have also ample examples and suggestions, from breaking down the disciplinary boundaries to mission-driven research, and also to combining research, education, and innovation. I think all of these were mentioned by quite a few panelists. So training and education research, these activities should be mission-driven and serve societal goals. And by doing that, we also need to connect the dots by going beyond disciplinary boundaries and to catch each other's blind spots of a single discipline. With that, I think I can hand over to the chair to have some closing remarks. Yume-san, over to you.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, may I? Yes,
yes,
for closing. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Shen, for the thorough summary of such diverse content. and very deep substance. I really appreciate it very much. In closing this session, I would like to identify two major points here as our homework for the next step. First one is, as everybody touched upon, there is an important connection between policy formulation and what we do as an academia. And we have been discussing about, how to integrate the academic research and evidence into the policy formulation for the last decade. But still we are talking about, how to tackle this integration between what we find out from the research and the policy formulation. So I think we really have to continue promoting the integration and synergy between policy formation and what we do in academic and the community. That's the the homework that we really have to keep in our mind in relation to the climate action and other SDGs. Second, okay, now we are talking about the synergies here between climate action and SDGs. Creating a synergy means we have to lift that sense of silos that we work on the different SDGs. And one of the, actually, it is very difficult things to do, but one of the promising phenomena I have seen at COP26 last year in Glasgow was, it was the first time that education minister, environment minister, and finance minister had a co-organized session to tackle the climate actions. So that was really the epoch-making, the scene that I have seen in a series of COP. So I would like to really consider that is really the stepping stone and the trigger point of breaking the silos, that what we do as an expert in different areas of the field of expertise. So I am really hoping this Synergy conference to take place in Tokyo will be a good opportunity for the dialogue, not only among the different experts, the people, but between policymakers and academia, and between civil societies, okay, and policymaking or the UN agencies, but also the intergenerational, the dialogue. And I am really hoping the COP27 to take place in November in Egypt, that we hope to see more of the integrated the conversation among the leaders, but also among the academia as well. Okay, so I really hope this side event taking place today can really trigger the new way of thinking among us and among the audience, so that we can really step forward and to make things happen. But I really, really appreciate all the speakers from different parts of the world and different parts of the expertise. And I am very much impressed with the very quality questions from the audience. And this is really good steps forward that we can really hope. Therefore, the good things would happen to coordinate the climate action and other SDGs, because we cannot really live without co-benefiting from each other. So I'd like to close this side event by congratulating all the speakers and all the audience who provided us the very good question to continue to think it over. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice morning, evening, and afternoon. Thank you.